Okay, so what you are seeing right now is a social media post by Ahmed Shihab al-Din, a Palestinian American and former Al Jazeera journalist. He writes in quotes, "We are speaking to, stop ignoring us. Hashtag brat." And accompanying his text is a graphic depicting Vice President Kamala Harris with her hand to her chest and the words, "I'm speaking," against the backdrop of an absolutely shattered landscape of bombed buildings in Gaza, with a myriad of small speech bubbles coming from the rubble that say, "Stop your bombs." It's an image that not only captures a lot of the contradictions of this week, but of the tenor and tone for the fight for Palestine solidarity this election year. Shihab Eldin is, of course, alluding to the incident that took place just a day or so again in Michigan, when protesters spoke out during the campaign speech for the vice president's newly revitalized presidential campaign. Harris had met two of the key organizers of the uncommitted movement, which has achieved unprecedented success in securing several delegates at the upcoming DNC convention, to push the Democratic Party and its candidate to commit to ending the genocidal war that has not only exacted a terrible cost on humanity, but threatens to spiral into a larger regional and global conflict. As noted in a Rolling Stone article by Tessa Stewart today, there have been subtle signals that Harris would be more inclined than her current partner in the executive office, Joe Biden, to support a change in U.S. policy towards Israel, including her calls for a ceasefire, reports that she's advocated for stronger criticism of Israel's handling of the war, and of course, this week's selection of Waltz, who expressed positive sentiment to the uncommitted movement in the past, over Josh Shapiro, a flagrant Zionist and critic of Palestine solidarity protests. But as Stewart also points, Harris has not articulated a distinct policy vision from the administration that she is unmistakably a part of right now. In fact, her own national security advisor, Phil Gordon, went out of his way to rebut reports that she might entertain discussions on an arms embargo. Of course, what happens publicly does not always reflect the internal tensions existing within any given administration. Harris is not the president, but the VP, and thus it would be unexpected for her to break suddenly and radically from the administration in which she serves. But asking voters, and particularly those affected by the genocide and millions in solidarity with them, to rely on speculation of how Harris might change U.S. foreign policy to end the maniacal behavior of the far-right regime in Israel is wholly insufficient both to the ends of ending what the international community is rightfully deeming a genocide and to winning an election that prevents a fascist like Donald Trump from seizing power again. After all, when the fascist and genocidaire Benjamin Netanyahu was applauded like a hero in Congress, Harris made both the decision not to attend, but also to inflame innuendos of anti-Semitism among those protesting Netanyahu, rather than saying a single word about the war crimes for which he is squarely responsible. And that is all to say, despite their best efforts, and the efforts of the Democratic Party establishment, Palestine as an issue is not going away. The New York Times has yet to publish an in-depth analysis of the release of the rape torture video of Palestinian prisoners that was released by Israeli news media this week. And yet that conversation is roiling Israeli society and evidencing, as one Haaretz article recently noted, the moral decay caused by the prevalence of fascist politics in Israel. Despite Israel's assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas has chosen Yahya Sinwar, not only further antagonizing Israeli leadership, and the region is now waiting on a precipice for Iran to launch a retaliatory attack for that assassination on its own soil. Harris is walking a tightrope of her and her own party's making. As the graphic illustrates, there is a singular decision that would stymie Israel's ability to continue to prosecute this series of war crimes, an embargo on arms. If Harris and the Democrats are serious about winning this election, then there will be no way to sit in a back room as Netanyahu continues to take center stage. And there will be no condescension or contempt or memified theatrics that will stop people of conscience from speaking out until the violence ends. Thanks again for joining us. We will have a Melissa fan join us, and then Samra will join us to run through today's updates on the news and analysis. And so with that, I will hand it over to Melissa.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. Let's begin our somatic practice. Just as you are right now, find your body. Find your body in this particular place in space and time. Notice any sensations that are arising, knowing that all of it is okay. All of it is okay and welcome. And as you're here noticing, begin to find your feet or the lowest extremities that you have. It helps to maybe move that part of your body, wiggle your toes, give it a little tap or pat. And see if you can direct your next breath down into that part of your body. Directing your conscious awareness to the left side, your left foot, and doing the same for the right side. Practicing right here the art of consciousness, the art of directing your conscious awareness. A common mistake that we make is thinking that we are entirely conscious beings all of the time. And that's simply not true. A lot of our human experience lies below our conscious awareness for a very good reason. Otherwise, we'd have to spend the majority of our days directing our hearts to beat, directing our lungs to expand and contract. And this practice of conscious awareness is important because conscious awareness is all that we really have. Our conscious awareness and our ability to direct our actions. And from here, finding yourself back to your breath and see if you could begin to tap into your longings, your desires for the world that we're building. Each of us is here because we are longing for a free Palestine. We are choosing to direct our conscious awareness and our actions towards making a free Palestine reality. And right now we're living in an era of fear. There's players on every single side which are trying to capture our attentions with fear. And fear is a deeply unconscious shape for your body, for our bodies. In fear, we react based on unconditioned and unconscious tendencies. And so tapping into your longings for a free Palestine, directing your conscious awareness to the future that we actually want to build, and moving from this place. Grounding again here in your breath. And see now if you can tap into a vision of a free Palestine. Imagining 200 years into the future, Palestine is free. What do you see? Holding on to that vision. and working backwards from there, taking the next smallest step that you can in your particular life with the relationships that you have. How do we get there? How do we get there together? Returning one last time to your breath. Thank you for practicing with me today.
Thanks, Melissa. I know I needed that grounding this week, especially with all that's going on. Samer, let's bring you up. And give me 1 second to just add a spotlight. Yeah, so I will try not to delay this any further. We talked yesterday with some organizers, giving a little bit of an overview of all that's been going on. So there's a lot to cover. I do appreciate you reminding us that today is Mahmoud Darwish's the anniversary of his death, and so we did play, um, a song in his honor, and I hope that sets the tone for what I know will be a very in-depth and thorough overview of all that there is to cover this week. So I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thanks, Thomas. It's kind of you to assume that. Let me just share my screen. As always, wow, what a week. Uh, just jumping right in. So much to cover. It's been, I think a lot of attention has been paid this week to things that are happening outside and around Palestine. There's a lot of focus on the regional war stuff and obviously domestic electoral issues here in the United States. We'll, of course, get to all of that, but it has been a particularly violent week in Gaza this past week in a way that I think a lot of folks hadn't noticed. And this is a sort of common Israeli playbook thing, right? When the world's attention is otherwise occupied, they often use that as an opportunity to really ramp up the violence. So even the official death count this past week went up quite significantly by over 500, which, as we know, means that the actual death count is probably at least double that, but hard to know. So there's a lot happening throughout Gaza. So per usual, we'll start in the south and work our way up. Uh, we've talked for a while now about the Rafah operation, which was again meant to be a limited operation in a way that appeased the Biden administration. And here we are in month 3 of the Rafah operation, where not only have they failed to capture the entire city, but the damage that they've caused to sort of the border crossings and arteries. CNN ran a piece on how the Rafah crossing is completely destroyed. They described it as the decimation of the area around the crossing, and like a series of fires that destroyed the infrastructure around there that the IDF refuses to explain. So that sort of like campaign of just degrading the infrastructure of Gaza's borders obviously continues. And 2 months into this into this Rafah offensive, they're still discovering truck height tunnels. So if you remember, they made a claim about a month and a half ago that they had like destroyed Hamas's tunnel infrastructure going into Egypt, and now they're still just like they've missed ones that are big enough to drive trucks through. So God knows how many more of those continue to exist in Rafah. I wanted to take just a moment. I think maybe we'll come back to this over the course of today's updates. To appreciate this Wall Street Journal opinion article that came out a little while ago by the Israeli foreign minister about how this Rafah operation is turning the tide in Israel's favor. And I think, this is probably a narrative that folks have heard a little bit in mainstream news articles in the past month or so. So I wanted us to like take a moment to sort of reflect on it and see how it measures up with what's actually happening on the ground. The sort of core piece of the argument that the foreign minister is making is that there's 2 pieces here that I think are really interesting. One, he talks about what he calls the media drumbeat, that is basically the popular consensus that, in his words, Israel's war is futile, its strategy is absent, its political isolation is growing. Um, and then goes into say like, oh no, actually the Rafah operation really changed the underlying political dynamics because now Hamas, and you can see in the next paragraph there, Hamas understands now that there will be no ceasefire without a hostage deal, which like, I mean, I think Hamas has always been the whole point of the ceasefire negotiations, the whole point of the hostages, right, was to secure this sort of agreement. So that is a meaningless statement. And secondly, that the IDF is acting aggressively in Gaza, which like, yeah, I don't know that either of those things are wins, but um, the narrative that there has been a sort of military shift in the Gaza Strip in Israel's favor as it sort of conducted these series of assassinations and is deploying its sort of West Bankification strategy that we've talked about in Gaza of like carving it up into chunks and then attacking those chunks. As we go through some of the rest of the regional updates, I do want you to keep those ideas in mind because I think the facts tell a very, very different story. Which unsurprising, you know, I think a common theme that we have in these updates is when politicos talk about something very in a very like braggy sort of way, it's almost always an indication that they're not doing that thing. So the need to go to write a Wall Street Journal op-ed saying we're winning, you know, if you're winning, you don't need to convince people that you're winning. You're probably not winning. So yeah, just a thing I think that's valuable to keep in mind because that narrative needs to be counteracted by like sober assessment of the facts. So Khan Yunis, which if folks remember, had a massive evacuation order a few weeks ago so that the IDF could go in and like clear out sort of Hamas remaining like militant contingents that were operating in the city, is now being evacuated again. So for the second time in a month or so. And in so doing, right, another series of atrocities being committed on the evacuating population, which is, you know, again, straight out of the playbook where the safe zones that they're telling people to go to become the areas that Israel focuses its bombing campaigns. The reason that Khan Yunis is being evacuated again is because whatever remaining IDF forces were in Khan Yunis got attacked pretty heavily in the past week, where a convoy was hit and ambushed. There was a series of rocket barrages, and then a weapons workshop was uncovered. So remember that this is less than 2 weeks after the IDF basically completely destroyed Khan Yunis, like brought it down to rubble, with its claim that it did that specifically to deactivate or to decommission the Hamas battalions that were operating in the area. So once again, we're seeing this like whack-a-mole game just sort of utterly failing. Similarly in central Gaza, you know, I just wanted to highlight like the really elevated bombing campaign from this past week that killed you know, dozens of Palestinians across the Gaza Strip, but also in central Gaza in the Nuseirat camp, and then also yet another attack on World Central Kitchen staff. After, if folks remember, in April, the whole controversy around the targeting of that WCK convoy, and you know the promises that like procedures were going to be put in place to prevent that from happening in the future, and then sure enough, it's happened again. And then all the way up north, I think this headline really says it all. Casualties after third Israeli strike on school in a week. So like this same individual school has been struck 3 times just in this past week in Gaza City. And again, part of this, you know, what we've seen in terms of the taxes of the last few months, if folks have been coming to these weekly updates and or probably just reading the news, is the bombing campaigns have largely focused on health and education and infrastructural services, right? So they just continue to claim that with no evidence that these schools are being used by militants. It's the same argument that they had previously been using for hospitals, and they're using that as an excuse to basically bomb whatever remaining infrastructure remains in Gaza. Yeah, and a series of like this Human Rights Watch story about literally just one house, like what the IDF did in a single home full of civilians, if you have the stomach for it, I would recommend it. It's a hard read, but a really powerful one about like just the way that the Israeli army continues to operate in Gaza, which is, as we know, without formal like conditions of deployment or without a formal rules of engagement that allow the people on the ground to sort of decide how they want to act and what level of violent force they use against civilians. Yeah. In the context of all of this, given that you're seeing basically the IDF caught in a series of fights across the Gaza Strip, like from the north to the south, what we're seeing is a series of independent assessments that have come out just in the past week, um, that are really sort of calling out the Israeli military's propaganda claims about the state of the fighting in Gaza. An article in CNN of all places, which takes an assessment from a series of conservative U.S. think tanks, including the American Enterprise Institute and a few like war studies institutes that are relatively reputable, which did an analysis that showed that of the original 24 battalions, they call them Hamas battalions, and I will admit that I also sometimes use that shorthand, but we are talking about a dozen or so different military groups that have independent leadership structures. But of course coordinate with one another. Of those 24 battalions, only 3 have been rendered combat ineffective, not even eradicated, mind you, but combat ineffective, meaning that they're not capable of doing any sort of large scale attacks. Um, and the remaining 21 battalions are still operational across Gaza Strip. And I think a giant reason for that they talk about is that recruitment is so high, which a thing that I think many people could have predicted that, not exactly hard to find people that want to fight the Israeli forces that have destroyed their homes over the past 9 months. So they get into a lot of detail about like the relative operational capacity of different battalions and which ones are basically fully operational and which ones are somewhere, have had to shift from the sort of more traditional command and control capabilities that they had into more guerrilla tactics due to reduced operational capability. But like, the whole idea of like there's just a couple more that Israel needs to root out, or that there's been a meaningful change in the balance of power in the Gaza Strip. Like just the data just doesn't show that at all. And if CNN saying that didn't seem like enough, a shockingly frank New York Times article this week as well, talking about the assessments from how how Hamas may emerge from this series of things that has happened, and they look specifically at the string of targeted assassinations that Israel carried out last week, including the assassination of the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, and Mohammed Deif, the military commander in Gaza, and come to the conclusion through they talk about analysts and regional observers say that those assassinations offered Israeli forces a short-term victory at the cost of long-term strategic success, right? Basically saying that they've laid the groundwork once again for things to be actually even worse for them. And we've seen, for example, that Hamas's leadership has now switched from their former leader, Ismail Haniyeh, to Yahya Sinwar, who is the architect of the October 7th attacks, who is known for, compared to Haniyeh, a more hardline approach vis-a-vis the Israelis, like less willing, I think, to compromise on things. That there are lots of implications on this for ceasefire negotiations and where power is centralized within Hamas and what that implies for its ability to operate forward and its orientation towards Israel. So we'll get into some of those things, I think, as we get to some of the ceasefire conversations, which are now. In the context of all of this, obviously, I think the global clamoring for a ceasefire has really elevated. We're at the point now where the Israeli cabinet itself is saying, you can see here this quite remarkable Times of Israel article from the 2nd of August, where security chiefs are pleading with the prime minister to take the ceasefire deal that's on the table, and Netanyahu is refusing, right? So in the context of both domestic pressure within Israel and broad international pressure uh, to sign the ceasefire agreement, and the growing awareness that it is Netanyahu singularly, not even the Israeli state, but that individual and his far right coalition, of course, that are blocking the willingness to sort of move forward on that for his own political benefit, um, is leading to a really complex moment where uh, uh, that pressure is producing interesting results, right? So, um, given that I think international actors and the US in particular are really pushing hard in this moment, like literally this week, to get that ceasefire signed as a way to reduce uh, the threat of a regional war. The idea being that a ceasefire could be enough of a win for the axis of resistance that they could then use that as they're like, okay, well, this is the thing that we wanted, therefore we don't have to retaliate for Israel's string of assassinations. Um, that full court press is putting additional pressure on the Israeli side to actually sign the agreement. It's interesting that the language that's being used both in this article and more broadly for this round of ceasefire negotiations that's starting on August 15th as being finalizing the framework of a hostage deal. So, there's a clear push here, there's a clear narrative push here to um, kind of create the global expectation that the ceasefire is imminent. But again, nothing Netanyahu has done has given us any indication that he's actually willing to sign a ceasefire agreement that would be under terms that would be like acceptable. Um, so it's hard to know where that's actually going to play out, or whether like we are in fact on the verge of something. But you murdering the chief negotiator on the Hamas side is probably not a good sign that ceasefire is realistically going to be ironed out in the next week or so. But it's possible, you never really know what surprises folks have up their sleeves. But what we are seeing in conjunction with that is uh, what could potentially be more pressure on the Israeli side from the United States, but also could easily be the same kind of like uh, toothless propaganda that we've been seeing from the Biden administration about a lot of this stuff, where every so often, they leak some information about how angry Biden is. So this is the latest version of Biden getting, real rootin' tootin' mad at Netanyahu while continuing to give him bombs and guns. Um, Basically saying that the U.S. That Israel is being ungrateful and is taking the United States for granted, a statement that is almost like pity inducing, almost like an absolutely wild thing for, the global superpower to be saying about its client state. You take me for granted. But the most important part of this Haaretz piece for me, if folks haven't had a chance to see it, is that it specifically says that the United States promised to not support Israel militarily for its regional endeavors, meaning that, it's this weird gray line here where they're saying that, of course, we will continue to defend Israel and give Israel what it needs to defend itself, but we won't be providing the backing for offensive Israeli capabilities. What they mean by those things is, obviously very nebulous, but it does open the door in a way that maybe the door wasn't open before, uh, for this sort of arms embargo push that's becoming a really centralized demand that, could be something that is becoming a little bit more conceivable, maybe. We have to, I think, situate that in the context of what is happening in the moment, which is a massive U.S. military escalation in the region. Not just the sending of a series of battle cruisers and other naval support units to the region in order to sort of back up Israel in case the regional war breaks out, but also quite scarily and you really can't see anything in this tweet. My apologies, but it is if you played the video, I think maybe you'd be able to see it. A stealth bomber, the B-2 stealth bomber. Um, this is capable of carrying nuclear weapons, but this stealth bomber is one that is coming from a base that manages nuclear weapons specifically. So very likely a nuclear armed stealth bomber has just arrived in Qatar a few days ago. Um, Not the kind of, if you're trying to send a deterrence message about like, hey, you better not escalate things, otherwise we're going to bomb you. You don't generally send a stealth bomber, right? You send like you're trying to like make big fanfare thing about it. So this is a scary development. This is a really scary development. Um, it remains the case, I think, that the axis of resistance folks, so Iran, Hezbollah, Yemen, uh, and militias in Iraq, for example, are still trying very hard to avoid the regional war. They clearly do not want to be dragged into a regional war. And again, this goes back to the what you say is sort of the opposite of what you do game, where, Iran has been rattling the saber very heavily, saying like, oh, wait till you see what we're gonna do. Um, is a sign that they don't want to, right? Like if they did, they would just do the actual thing. And so I think Iran is in a bit of a hard place right now where it needs to demonstrate a certain degree of deterrence. It needs to reestablish the idea that like there are consequences for bombing and assassinating people on its territory, but to do that in a way that doesn't lead to an actual, meaningful military escalation, which nobody except um, like a partial segment of the Israeli political class seems to want, and probably also a partial segment of the U.S. political class. Obviously, it's keen to sort of do this, regional reset. Um, so it's hard. It's hard to know what's going to happen with that. There has been some talk recently that a ceasefire that is like enacted would be enough. Um, of a like enough to assuage an Iranian retaliation. I think those are statements being put out by the Iranian government, which is somewhat promising. Um, but it's really hard to say. I personally was very much expecting to have seen like that the response would have happened in this past week and that we would have been talking about it today, but no. So it may not, it may come from like a more like a partial response from one of the actors versus the sort of large coordinated response that a lot of people were predicting. But I don't know, time will tell. Um, it's not particularly promising given that what the US seems to be doing to break through this ceasefire impasse is providing guarantees for Israel that it is okay if the ceasefire breaks down after phase one. So if folks remember, the ceasefire negotiations are still being conducted around these three phases, where the first phase is, the release of like infirm and civilian hostages, uh, along with the like, withdrawal of the IDF from population centers. And the big sticking point has been between Hamas and Israel is that Hamas wants like guarantees that phase one leads into phase two, and Israel very much wants to do phase one without being pressured to like have that roll directly into phase two, basically get the hostages back and then resume the bombing. And so if the US is providing those guarantees to Israel, like it's going to be very hard, I think, for anyone else to agree to that, given like, yeah, I like Hamas has said multiple times that they would never sign a ceasefire that doesn't include a permanent end to the violence. So um, hard to know where that's going to go. While folks have been paying a lot of attention in Gaza, a lot has been happening in the West Bank, a series of additional settlement expansions and land grabs, along with drone strikes and Israeli soldier like assassinations of Palestinian civilians. I believe at this point, the number of civilians killed in the West Bank has outstripped the number of Israeli civilians killed on October 7th, just to give you a sense of like this arena where people aren't even really paying much attention. continues to just be like horrifically violent. The situation in the West Bank is increasingly untenable, which is a thing that we could spend the entire hour on, but unfortunately we cannot. Uh, the sexual violence revelations continue to be really, really shocking. Folks remember last week the sort of right to rape riots that broke out at the Israeli detention facility and at the Israeli courts, where they tried to arrest the 9 soldiers who raped Palestinian prisoners. This week, video footage leaked of Israeli soldiers raping Palestinians, including raping a Palestinian detainee to death. Were a series of really wild like TV interviews, a sort of national debate happening right now about whether or not this is okay. I have to admit that I didn't watch this video. I tried and I could not bring myself to do it, but uh the idea that like this sort of tactic is a thing being debated in the society is a really grim sign. I don't really know what else to say about that. Given that given the prominence Western media assigned to allegations of sexual violence on October 7th, and that being the justification in a lot of ways for the horrific violence inflicted upon Palestinians, the idea that like anyone who would commit that kind of sexual violence is like worse than an animal. To see the way that that was framed on what often ended up being very spurious allegations. To be clear, there is documented sexual violence from October 7th, but a lot of the claims of rape have really fallen apart under scrutiny. Given the weight that that was given versus how little you're hearing about any of this, and like what it implies, I think it um, is a really shocking revelation that I think maybe like more attention should absolutely be paid to all of this. Um, and just to say that that facility, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's like Stay Timan or whatever, that this like torture center that led to this entire, the riots breaking out that had all these exposés that forced the sort of Israeli government to try to arrest those soldiers. That facility is still operational, right? Like it's still running and it's still doing all of the things that were outlined in those revelations. There's a Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, who put out a report a few days ago about the prison camps, the over a dozen prison camps where Israelis basically like the crux of the report is that the term prison camp isn't really accurate. They're torture centers, that they're designed specifically for the torture of Palestinian prisoners. So the fact that this is sort of not only continuing, but in many ways accelerating, I think really speaks volumes about the inability of the so-called international community to really put pressure on this to meaningfully stop or change. Where it goes is really hard to imagine at this point. Forgive me for the very sharp turn from that to Tim Walz, but just the other, I think, like big political update of the week, of course, was, Thomas mentioned this a little bit, so I don't think I have to get into too much detail, but the idea that Kamala Harris's number one pick for vice president, Josh Shapiro, who was widely perceived to be a very ardent Zionist and has a very pro-Zionist, pro-Israel position, compared Palestine campus protesters to the KKK, and tried to pushed a lot of things to make BDS illegal in Pennsylvania, et cetera, et cetera. That person was seen as such a liability for a number of reasons, that his vice presidency was sunk, right? And I think like we should be really clear about what happened in the past week. It seems to me that a series of things were leaked about Josh Shapiro being the choice, and we had heard, and I think we talked about this last week, that the Harris campaign had leaked that information sort of to assess the vibe, to get a sense of how amenable the public would be to that choice. And the answer was not very, right? So there was enough pressure put on the Harris campaign about that decision that they rescinded it, basically. I mean, we don't really know, but that seems to be the case based on what we do know. Um, why they rescinded it is a different question, right? Like, is it a result of Palestine activism or specifically Josh Shapiro's Zionism is what sunk him? It's hard to say. I think there are a few different compounding factors here. I definitely think it was a factor. There's no question to me that it was a factor. The question is the size of the factor, right? I thought, there's a couple of different levels here. Like at the next level, um, it's clear that a broad coalition of people came out against Josh Shapiro, including, for example, teachers and unions and like environmental justice groups who were upset about a number of his political positions. But I think it's also really important to consider that a lot of that work was also being done in conjunction with the Palestine Solidarity people. So like those movements were doing it in a sort of united way, right? There was a common thread through all of those concerns about Josh Shapiro. And the fact that not only that movements successfully pressured that sort of right-wing VP pick out, but also that it was done in a way that, as we've talked about forever, right? Like Palestine is not just about Palestine. It's a reframing of our entire conception of like how, um, you know, governance and society should be, right? So the combination of Palestine solidarity with union solidarity, with teacher solidarity, with environmental justice and other social justice stuff like is a natural outgrowing, and I think speaks something about the strength of the movement. So we talked a lot about what Josh Shapiro is, but it's probably worth spending a few moments on what Tim Walz is. It's worth noting here, for example, that I've got this very old press release from Barbara Lee about Tim Walz being one of the few voices that spoke up very strongly against the US's invasion of Iraq and against Obama's increasing military entanglement in Syria. And like, you know, Walz has like spoken at APAC things. He deployed the National Guard on protesters after the George Floyd uprising. I and other Iraq comrades were in Minnesota for the Line 3 water protector stuff, where under Governor Tim Walz, right, the police who were being paid by a foreign oil company or gas company were like beating the hell out of protesters. So, I think, everybody knows this, I'm sure, but it's good to reflect on the fact that like Tim Walz is not our salvation, right? He's not, Hassan Kanafani like reincarnated as a Minnesota governor. He's not an anti-Zionist. Like his policies aren't like the win of Tim Walz isn't that he's like perfectly aligned with us, but compared to what the alternative would have been, it's a real step forward. And I think we just need to be like clear-eyed about what to reasonably expect from this and the extent of the win, right? Like it is a win, but I don't know that like the Walz Harris ticket is going to still require a lot of community pressure to do the right thing. Their natural inclinations, I think, will obviously not bend in that direction. And in that context, Thomas talked about at the start of their session today, Harris's really horrific, like really tone deaf response to protesters at her rally, where she, people like speaking up about the genocide, she told them to shut up. Not a great sign. And the flip side of that is like right before that rally, she was meeting with members of the uncommitted movement and, expressed a willingness to talk to them about this idea, like this demand of an arms embargo as being a sort of like core demand for folks to support the Democratic Party in the upcoming election. And like that's a shift. It's a meaningful shift. There's a question there, I think, about what is shifting. Like for sure, the tone is shifting. The question is it only the tone that's shifting? which itself is like a realization of where sort of, the public is at politically? Um, or is this an indication of policy shifts to come? And, the answer usually is like somewhere on that spectrum, right? Um, uh, and yeah, like, Ben Rhodes, who the former uh, like foreign policy advisor to Obama, described it like his take on it was uh, that Harris is trying to thread a needle, right? That a different tone signals a potential change in direction if she takes office, but she's still the vice president, so she can't come out and say, "Here's a whole different policy," yet. It's a little optimistic, I think, but like I think broadly it's probably accurate on some level. Um, I wanted to just take a quick reflection on like the sort of tactics of pressuring Kamala Harris and the usefulness of these sorts of like campaign stump speech heckles and like the way that we sort of bird dog uh elected officials everywhere. I saw this really great juxtaposition of like how 15 years ago um the people who were heckling Obama, who were then like widely vilified in the media and whatever, were, dreamers, gay marriage supporters, trans rights folks, um, and like people protesting "Don't ask, don't tell." And all of those people were like, "How dare you heckle? Like this is so rude, whatever, whatever." And these people are all now like, lauded by the Democratic Party as being like a core part of their coalition. So just to say that, this is the tactic, right? And it is a tactic that historically has been proven to work. Not to say that that's the only tactic that we should be deploying with Kamala Harris. I do think more time and thought needs to be given into how, in terms of like even just sort of the discourse, uh, talking to like pressuring the Harris campaign may be different than pressuring the Biden campaign. Not that it's not going to require pressure, but the fact that we at least have some sense of an inside-outside strategy here, I think does change things a little bit. That requires some reflection on this. But the Not Another Bomb people, I think, have been really inspiring in pushing that forward. That being, the uncommitted movement's new incarnation, which is basically demanding this arms embargo. Um, Holding both of those pieces in your head is difficult. I have been struggling with how to think about this sort of shift to Harris, and what it means for our movement. So my like number one recommendation for if you haven't read that this week is this Max Elbaum article, which for me I think was really clarifying in thinking about how this moment is different than it was 3 weeks ago. The energy has changed, but the underlying politics haven't. Right, the idea um, that like Kamala Harris policy wise is largely a continuation of the Biden administration, but that doesn't mean that there hasn't been a change. Uh, Even if that change like operates on a different sort of like discursive or kind of a broad narrative level, um, that's meaningful, right? And I think Max's three lessons here are really worth pulling out. That a grassroots movement can really alter the political dynamics in a country, even if it has not yet achieved its immediate goal. So, like, we haven't won the ceasefire, but in advocating for a ceasefire, we have fundamentally changed the political dynamics of this country, and I think that's unquestionably true. And then similarly, that being part of, or being in many ways the first instigators of the campaign to push Biden out, has sort of like demonstrated as sort of integrated Palestine at the cutting edge of this broader left fight for like this anti-fascist fight, right? For developing an actually fair and representative system. And third, the critical nature of how the left orients itself to these fights and the importance of not sitting it out because of inconsistencies in Democrats' opposition to fascism. So there's a lot here. I really recommend the article. I'm not only saying that because I think Max is here listening, but it really is probably the best thing I read this week. For the election, I did want to note, like, as we talk about these changing dynamics, some polling data that I think is particularly important. including the fact that, I think we've talked about this before, but Democrats by a 4-1 margin. There aren't many things these days that are a 4-1 margin. 70% to 20%. So 3.5 to 1. Favor withholding and withdrawing military aid to Israel if Israel rejects the current ceasefire proposal, which they have. So given those overwhelming numbers, like I think a change in Democratic Party positioning on this is inevitable. I really do think it's inevitable. I think with the right pressure, uh, it's very unlikely that they'll produce something that they call an arms embargo. But withholding military aid to Israel, I think, is absolutely on the horizon. So I think that's a thing we should be looking out for. In the context of that, maybe I'll jump to this and then come back to that, just to say that the UK is now suspending export licenses to Israel. So it got caught up in some bureaucratic nonsense, but now it is in fact being done. And this is from a Labour Party that historically, not even historically, that very recently tried to purge its ranks of anti-Zionists, is still taking this position, which I think tells you a lot. There's more there about the Nagasaki stuff, but just to quickly come back to the other big electoral thing that I wanted to touch on, which is, of course, the loss of Cori Bush's primary race this past Tuesday. Hard to overstate, I think, the magnitude of this loss. I'm very much in my feels about it. There are not many people at that level of like political power who have spoken in that way about the Palestinian struggle for freedom. And like to hear Cori Bush have spoken about how, she knew that sponsoring the ceasefire resolution and being very outspoken for Palestine would come at a very big political cost, but she felt like she had to do it because Palestinians were there for her during the Ferguson uprisings. So yeah, like the fact that AIPAC is still able to spend $10 million to defeat our like people who are espousing our political positions is terrifying. It's a really bad sign, I think. And the fact that she lost by a small number, I think, cuts a couple of ways. On the one hand, uh, it's a good sign, I suppose, that AIPAC spends $10 million, technically nine something $1 million, and can only get the candidate to win with 51% of the vote. The second, I think, or possibly third most expensive congressional race in history, largely just on one side. On the flip side, that small margin means we could have won. Like if we put in the ground game, I think like if folks gave it what I think is the importance that it was due. So that's hard. I think it's hard to sit with that a little bit, but may it be a lesson to us, I think, about how to manage these things going forward. I just wanted to mention for your reference some great articles on the continued complicity of tech companies, particularly Amazon and Google and Microsoft, for Israel's genocide. There's a great post by the No Tech for Apartheid about what's happening there. I'm hip enough to know that this was done in the style of Brat. Is that right? This looks like a Brat Instagram post. I don't know what I'm saying. Anyway, check out those links. I think it's valuable for folks that are following that stuff. And then in my very quick summation, those big Israel intelligence wins last week from those targeted assassinations and things have already sort of failed to produce any lasting gains. Regional war still is more likely probably than it's ever been, but hopefully still unlikely. And we'll know, I think, probably a lot more by next week. The U.S. military support remains the key linchpin for why Israel is able to escalate like this. And then when we think about the Harris Walls campaign, there's no question that they still require pressure to do the right thing. And from all indications are more susceptible to that pressure than Biden was. So there are opportunities there. Upcoming actions that I want to highlight, the Not Another Bomb folks calling for an arms embargo to Israel will be at the DNC next weekend. And so there will be a local action here. Details for that haven't been produced yet, but they will be coming soon. And this isn't really an action, but I did want to note that AROC finally has launched a general membership. So if you are a SWANA person and want to get involved in AROC and you're based in the Bay Area, please register at the link in the slide. And that's it. Check out the calendar for events, text the number for updates, and check out the PAL Media Tracker for information on the news articles that inform this analysis.
Samara, thanks. I have something really important to ask you about your run through just before we close. Could you clarify exactly what constitutes rootin' tootin' mad? And might it be because is it and secondarily, does it is it because Nancy Pelosi went publicly said that she was not impressed with Biden's political operation?
I can't believe she said that, by the way. I really don't know what's in Nancy Pelosi's coffee lately, but I want some of it. Rootin' tootin' mad is when you're fed up with the malarkey, basically.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to also just second Samara's endorsement of Max's article. I think it's a really useful strategic kind of piece in terms of looking at the understanding the current shift in the moment. A couple of other announcements. We will be making some announcements about some mass meetings coming in the fall, and hope to have that information to you out soon. On the CPE front, we're going to be doing an event next week on the uprisings in Bangladesh, and it will include a couple, if not several, Bangladeshi organizers from on the ground in Bangladesh. So really encourage folks to check that out and keep an eye out for the announcement. Um, Also, save Friday, September 13th, for something again totally not related to the PSA, but we will be having our 25th anniversary party. So would encourage folks to come and join us there. Um, and yeah, there will be action. Some of the stuff there's still some other stuff that has not yet been announced. So as Samar mentioned, keep an eye out both on AROC's page and on the event page just for upcoming actions and announcements. And encourage you also as well, since many of you are organizing actions, to use that to submit actions that are happening not just in Oakland or San Francisco, but across the Bay Area as well. We'll be back next week with another PSA. Thanks again for joining us, and keep an eye out for the recording. And please share it and distribute it. We want these to get out to more folks. We hope that they've continued to be useful and continue to get good feedback on their usefulness this each week. And yeah, so if you know someone that would love to get a digest of what's going on and some of this analysis, please share it with them. And we'll see you next week.